Welcome, everyone, to the webinar today. Very glad to have you here to discuss this really important topic. My name is Kirsten Miller-Dauberman, and I'm going to be your host for today's conversation. Of course, as you just saw, this webinar is brought to you by getAbstract, and we're all about helping you grow as leaders, as businesses, as organizations. And we know that this topic today with our very special guest is going to help us all do just that. Before I introduce her and our topic, just a few housekeeping notes that we do before every webinar. Just want to let you all know that you are muted. We also will be taking questions for Minda. So at any time, if you have a question, you can pop it in there in the chat, and we will be presenting those questions to Minda as appropriate throughout the webinar. Also, this webinar is going to be recorded. So after the webinar, you will receive a recording for internal usage and if you need to watch it again. And of course, if you have any further questions or anything we can help you with, you can email us at any time at corporate@getAbstract.com. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into our conversation. So we are talking today about women of color in business, a fireside chat with author Minda Harts. This conversation is going to explore how to make the workplace work for everyone, especially women of color. And of course, to help lead us in that conversation and effort is Minda Harts. She is the CEO of the Memo LLC, which is a career development platform for women of color. She is the best-selling author of The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table. Minda is an assistant professor at NYU Wagner. She's been featured on MSNBC's Morning Joe, Fast Company, The Guardian, and Time Magazine. Minda frequently speaks at companies like Microsoft, Levi's, Google, and Bloomberg on topics such as leadership, managing diverse teams, and self-advocacy. She also hosts a weekly podcast called Secure the Seat. And of course, you can read the abstract of the memo on getAbstract.com. It's there in our library, but of course you should read the book and read the entire thing. But here to share her wisdom with us today is Minda Harts. Welcome, Minda. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the warm introduction. Hey, everybody, we're happy that you're here.
Yeah. So first of all, what was the motivation to write this book, and particularly, your personal journey to getting here, to have the bravery and the courage to speak up and write this work?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. So, for those who haven't had a chance to read the memo yet, I hope that you will get your hands on the abstract and the book. But it's interesting that we're here talking about how to make the workplace work for everybody, because when I entered into corporate America, I was a first generation college student. I was the first person in my family to enter into a corporate role. And so I didn't know what I didn't know. I was under the assumption that I did the work. I went to college, I checked the boxes. And when I entered into the workplace, I found myself as the only one. And if you've ever been the only one of anything, then you know how isolating at times that can be if you are not part of the dominant majority. And I think sometimes people take that for granted, being able to work alongside with people who look like you, who identify the way you do. And so I was the only woman of color, the only Black woman for a very long time. And when I entered into that workplace, I started to shrink a little bit because there were certain uh, people and personalities that would say certain things to me, and I felt as though I didn't have agency, I didn't have a space, or I didn't have any allies to be able to speak up on certain things. So when certain people would micro or macro aggress me, or say things that are inappropriate, it was up to me not to take it the wrong way, right? There was no expectation or accountability for anybody else to do the right thing or say the right thing. And so I leaned into that. But it was, as I was entering into the workforce, I realized that the workplace doesn't work for everybody, right? If you work
Mm.
really hard, yes, that helps, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're advanced at the same rate as some of your counterparts. Because if you are part of the dominant majority, you may not see yourself in me, right? You may never say to yourself, oh, Minda reminds me of my son, right? Or my daughter, or reminds me of a younger version of myself. And so I didn't have that in a lot of my managers or my colleagues. And it was around 2012 when the murder of Trayvon Martin happened. I was living in Los Angeles, and if for those who are in Los Angeles, you know that there's a popular street called Wilshire Boulevard, and there was a demonstration happening on Wilshire. And I thought to myself when I went out to the street to join in the demonstration that Black lives do have to matter outside, but what would it look like if we had the conversation about Black lives mattering inside the workplace, right? Mattering enough that it's mirrored on the About Us pages, that it's mirrored in leadership, that it's mirrored in every facet of the organization. And Kirsten, I started to interrogate and investigate what that meant and what my role would be, so that people see that everybody has value in the workplace, right? And that we can dismantle racist ideologies and biases if we decide to lean into our courage and talk about it and acknowledge these things exist. And so I know we're going to talk about a little bit more, but I really started to think about the stories that we tell. And a lot of the business books and career books are written primarily by white men and women. And so it excludes the experiences of anybody who doesn't identify that way. And not to say that those books don't have great advice. I've read a lot of them and I use that advice. But what I realized was we have to have an intersectional lens in the workplace because not everybody experiences the workplace the same. And Toni Morrison, she was a really prolific writer, and she said, write the book you want to read. And that is what I did. That's what I did.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of those varying experiences, you provide a lot of insights in the book into how corporate spaces vary, and that they do for women of color versus other white people. Can you share some examples that illustrate those differences of experience in the corporate workplace?
Absolutely. So my first manager, he happened to be a white man, and he noticed that I had burnt orange fingernail polish on one day, and he says, "You people love your bright colors." And he joked around for 15 minutes about how Black people like bright colors. I've never experienced in my 15 years in corporate America, Kirsten, anybody saying that to somebody else, about their nail color, about you people. And so, yes, some people would say, oh, he was just joking. Oh, that's just Jim being Jim. But Jim being Jim is also causing someone like myself harm, right? So the racial undertones, the jokes that are not appropriate, often that was a daily occurrence for me. And I never felt the psychological safety to be able to say anything, nor did any of my colleagues feel that they needed to say anything, right? And so again, when we don't talk about these things, we all know when somebody said something inappropriate, but we have a choice, right, to either acknowledge it or to pretend that it doesn't exist. But when it lands on someone like myself or another person of color, when we hear those things, we don't get to just exit the meeting, right? The virtual meeting. We sit with that. We play it on a reel. And so those are some of the hurtful language that happens inside the workplace. And two things can be true at the same time. They might not have meant harm, but it doesn't mean it didn't cause harm, right? So we have to empathize and humanize everyone's experiences in the workplace. The other thing that I would say is the pay gap. Oftentimes we say that, at least here in the United States, that women make 79 cents to 80 cents on a dollar, but that's only white women. And we, when we talk about gender initiatives, most of the gender initiatives that benefit women tend to benefit more toward white women. And so we don't talk about all the other women, Black women, Latinx women, Indigenous women, Asian women. We don't talk about those other intersections of race and gender. And so oftentimes we are left out from the conversation, and we don't have some of those resources and sponsors and mentors that are invested in our success like they are others. And so I think it's so important that we talk about the intersectional lens in the workplace, because I do believe that all of us want to make the workplace work for everybody, not just some people, but we have to listen, we have to educate, and we have to activate what we've learned so that we make sure that we're creating a workplace that works for everyone. The last thing that I'll say is the leadership gap. When you look at the leadership of Fortune 500 companies or many organizations, if you look at the leadership team, they're pretty majority white. And it's hard to, if we're thinking about leadership in the 21st century and beyond, you have to have a lot of different voices and perspectives and experiences around that table to solve these problems going forward. And so if you say that diversity, equity, inclusion belonging matter, you also have to demonstrate that to the people who are sitting out there who might not look the same way you do. And so right now we have to activate and we have to demonstrate what good looks like. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to get to good.
Absolutely. And thank you for being one of those leaders, Minda. So you talked about education. So how can you and other women of color, as you mentioned, in a workplace, try to help other people understand what you're going through, what you just described so eloquently and articulately on a day-to-day basis to some of their colleagues?
Yeah, so Kirsten, I'd love to use the analogy of a car ride. When I was younger, my family, we came from very humble beginnings, but there was one trip, one summer trip that we would always take, which was to an amusement park, and it was 3 hours away. And I'm one of three kids, and we'd be in our tiny car, but I'd be sitting in the middle seat. If you've ever ridden in a car, you've ever had to sit in the middle seat, then you know that is not the most comfortable place to be, right? And it definitely isn't comfortable for 3 hours or any longer than that. And when we get to our destination, my parents would be smiling, they'd be happy, they'd be like, wasn't that a great car ride? And I'd be sitting there, Kirsten, and I'd be like, were they not in the same car that I was in? Did you not hear me and my brothers saying, don't touch me, get off me, get out of my space? And you feel that, but here's the thing, we were all in the same car, but we experienced that car ride very differently. And it's just like the workplace, right? We might be working at the same place, but we experience that workplace very differently. There will only be people who only ever get to drive the car, right? They don't even know what it feels like to sit in the back seat. There will be people who only get to ride shotgun, right? They don't even know what it's like to not have enough room in the back seat because they have all this extended leg room, right? And there's that person that has only felt that car ride from the middle. They've sat in the middle. They might have been sitting there for years, working in that same row, wishing, hoping that somebody in the front seat would look back and say, oh, I wonder if they're comfortable or not, right? What do they need to be successful? What can I do to leverage their experience to make sure that they too have an opportunity to drive the car, to pick the music, right? To have that agency. And even if I do ask them what you need to be successful while they're sitting in that middle seat, that they feel comfortable enough to tell me, you know what, this has been uncomfortable, or I do have aspirations to sit in that front seat. So when you think about the workplace, think about where you sit, right? Two things can be true at the same time. You could be thriving and having access to all the opportunities while somebody else is suffering in the workplace, barely surviving, right? Feeling like they're going unnoticed, like nobody thinks about them or cares about them. And that's just the way the workplace, in order for us to change that discomfort, right? For some, we have to look at where we sit in the organization and say, what can I do to make sure that I'm using my privilege, using my influence, using my access to help others who are sitting in different spaces that I'm in, right? And let's be honest, some people feel like they're not even in the car yet, like they are still showing up every day at the bus stop, right? And wishing
Yeah.
somebody would invite them into the car, right? We all have the ability to speak someone else's name in the room. We all have the ability to ask somebody, hey, I noticed that something happened in our last meeting. I just want to check in, right? How can I be helpful if a certain situation happens again? And so think about where you sit in the car and how you can be helpful to someone who may not be in a position that you sit, right? We all have that ability to do that, but we have to be aware, right? We have to be aware, and we also have to ask the questions and build those relationships with other people so that they can tell us what we need from them to be good. And the other thing that I'll say for those who are people managers, when's the last time you went to every person on your team, even in a virtual environment, and said, what do you need from me to do the best work of your career? Asking
Mhm.
those questions, right? So that everybody feels valued. Everybody feels like their manager is invested in their success, not just their go-to people, not just those rising stars, right? And so
Yeah.
it's important that we do ask those questions and we're invested in everyone's success because again, we could be working at the same place and experiencing that workplace very differently.
Yeah, that's an excellent analogy. And we actually have a great question from one of our viewers. I'd love to pose it to you. They ask, how do you deal with being a woman of color in leadership in your institution if you're not being taken seriously and afforded the same respect as your male or white colleagues? What are your suggestions? Yeah, suggestions, or she says, as your male or white colleagues, or your suggestions are being ignored, etc. Any suggestions?
Yep, I think, thank you for your question. And I think this is the part where our allies or managers, they have to be aware, right? There has to be some emotional intelligence activated to say, how is equity being used in this room, right? If Minda is the only woman of color, the only Black woman in the room, she can be the only one for a short period of time, but does she feel like she has agency to chime in? Are we leveraging her experience, right? It's not enough just to be in the room if you're not leveraging the experience of that talent that you've invited into the room. So if you're in the room and you're not giving someone the opportunity to chime in on certain initiatives or decision making process, you have to think, okay, I'm silencing someone else's voice, right? They've worked really hard to get here. And so I think that on the woman of color or the Black woman or anyone who feels othered in those rooms, making sure that the people who are in those rooms are listening and giving everybody the equitable opportunity to chime in and listen, because I think that's the key. Sometimes, women of color, we do get into some of these, a seat at the table, and then we're not oftentimes heard, right? We're just like, oh, you should
Mm.
just be grateful to be here. But being grateful is not on the job description. I worked really hard to get here. And
Yeah.
so everybody's voice, just like Tom's voice or Kim's voice is valid, our voices should be too. And that's where equity comes in. Equity is everyone has agency in this room, and we have to create that. We have to be intentional about that. And so if you're in those rooms and sometimes you're speaking over other people, other women of color, being aware of those things. And if you're one of those people that's there in the room, this is your opportunity to activate your allyship, right? Saying, hey, Tom, I noticed that Minda had something she was, attempting to say, but you cut her off. Minda, would you like to finish your statement? These are the ways that we create workplace norms. These are the ways that
Yeah.
we signal to our colleagues that no, we're not going to allow that type of behavior anymore. And it doesn't mean slamming somebody or making a scene, but it means let's hold people accountable so that we create a workplace that works for everybody, not just some people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk a lot about securing your seat at the table. I love that word secure because it's not just like take your seat or whatever. It's like getting it and then securing it. What steps can women of color specifically take to do that, and then develop the resilience? Because also, you mentioned microaggressions, and then in other interviews, talk about these little cuts that stay with you and accumulate over time. So how does one get that seat and then secure it, building resilience to be able to stay there, and then, as you mentioned, bring up other women of color as well?
Yes, absolutely. Love this question. So part of, again, I think our Michelle Obama, she often says, some people get to the table and they're too afraid to shake it up. And it's like, I feel the same way. It's like once you get your seat, this is where the real work starts, right? This is where you really get to activate. And it's not just your voice, but you also have, I hope you have a responsibility to, or feel a sense of responsibility to bring other women of color with you and other women if they're not represented as well. And so part of that is number one, your mindset, because as a woman of color, oftentimes we are the only or one of few. And so oftentimes we don't get to see ourselves. We don't have mentors or sponsors that look like us in the workplace. And so sometimes you could feel imposter syndrome, or you could feel like you're not worthy or you don't belong or you're not included. And some of those things may be true, but then sometimes that creeps into our psyche, right? And it shows us that, oh, well, maybe we don't belong. Maybe we should just, fall back, or maybe we shouldn't go for that promotion because I haven't been promoted in 5 years. Some of the environments that we're in would sometimes show us that we don't belong, right? And that can really chip away at your esteem if you let it. And so the number one thing I would say, and this is part of your control, you may not be able to control what your colleagues do, but you can control being right within, shifting from an enemy state of mind to an empire state of mind, one that I belong in every room I enter, but maybe this room isn't the right one for me, right? So taking that power back, taking that control. And I think because we do experience a lot of, racism in the workplace, that could really chip away at who you want to be, and who your future self needs you to be in the workplace. And so I would say make sure that mentally you're mentally fit. continue to do that mental hygiene and whatever that might mean to you. The other thing, the next step is building your network, having that social capital so that you don't have to fight all the battles alone, that there are people that you've built relationships with, even in this virtual environment, who can speak your name in the rooms that you're not in, right? Who can think of you when opportunities, because you've articulated your value and you've quantified your worth. They know, oh yeah, Minda's been interested in this. There's an opportunity coming in. Minda's the right one for the job, right? They know that. They've gotten to know us, so they're thinking of us in that way. And then lastly, I would say self-advocacy, because I think sometimes as women, definitely as Black and brown women, sometimes we're afraid to say how we feel or ask for what we want. But self-advocacy is one of the greatest forms of self-love. If I don't advocate for myself, then who else is going to sometimes, right? So know that you have a voice. Kirsten, when I was in the workplace, I often thought, wow, I've lost my voice. I don't know where it is anymore. I'm afraid to ask. Let me just
Oh,
be grateful for these things. And then I realized that I have my voice. I just have to decide how I want to use it. So as women of color
mm,
out there, how do you want to use your voice? As women, as anyone who's listening today, how do you want to use your voice? Because it doesn't just benefit you, it benefits the next generation, it benefits current generations. And so whenever I'm nervous or afraid, I think about it from that perspective. I'm doing this, I'm activating my voice because it's going to make the workplace better than I found it.
mm, absolutely. Another couple great questions I want to bring in from our audience. One is, how do you handle microaggressions coming from a senior leader or someone you report directly to? What is the best approach?
Yep. This is it's a very difficult question. It's an important question because there's a fine line, right? Just like anything in the workplace, if you're feeling some type of opposition or resistance from someone in leadership, oftentimes you feel again like you don't have a voice, like nobody's listening to you, that you can't maybe go to HR because you might not feel safe enough to do that. Because oftentimes when women activate their voice in that way, that seemed as aggressive or seems as angry or seems as combative, then we're the problem, right? When actually we need
Mm,
to make sure that that isn't always, that shouldn't be the default, that the woman is the problem, right? So I think that we have to change the workplace, and again make it work for everybody, and that means creating systems and processes that people feel safe to articulate what's happening to them, right? And so if there hasn't been a system of creating psychological safety where a woman of color feels comfortable even saying how she's been racially aggressed, then that's a problem, right? When I was in my former workplace, I was getting it from every angle, and I didn't feel like I could go to anybody and tell them about
mm,
it. And that's unfortunate, right? I was doing a really great job in my role, but because I was getting this racial aggression from certain coworkers who had a lot of influence, I felt like I couldn't say anything, and that started to affect my mental health. And that's not what we want. So I really do think that we have to dismantle the system of silencing voices. And again, because that's not making the workplace work for everybody. Just like sexual harassment or any type of other harassment, racial aggression should be top of the list as well. That should be just as much of um, an offense as any other offense in the workplace. And we have to take these things seriously. And so the one thing that I would say, when somebody has the courage to come and tell you that you've harmed them in this way, that you be a courageous listener, number one, because it takes courage to be
mm,
able to come to someone and say, hey, what you said to me last week in the meeting, I know you might not have meant any harm, but it did cause me harm when you said that, oh, I see that you finally got your hair done today because you had it in braids last week. When you say certain things like that, which that is a truth statement, it didn't happen to me, but it happened to a woman who recently sent me a message. When you say things like that, that harms me. I would appreciate if you don't do that again. It takes a lot of courage to come and tell somebody that. So if someone comes and tells you that, be a courageous listener, hear them out, right? Don't let your first reaction be defensive and tell someone, oh, you took it the wrong way, I didn't mean it that way, blah, blah, blah. No, that two things can be true at the same time. You might not have meant any harm, but it caused harm. So the response really is on the person that's causing the harm to say, you know what, I apologize that landed the way that it did. That was not my intention, but I'm glad you made me aware of it so that I don't do it again, right? Because don't we want to hear these things so that we don't keep harming our coworkers? Um, Creating that psychological safety should be table stakes inside the workplace, right? It shouldn't be an option. And we have to normalize dismantling that. So if a woman of color comes to you, regardless of what level in the company, hear them out, because it took a lot of courage for them to come and tell you that this was a problem, and know that you're not a woman of color, so it might have caused harm to someone, right? And so I think that this is why we're having this conversation, the education, because for so long we have not talked about what causes harm to other groups, right? And so once we
Mhm.
know, we should hopefully want to do better and know that that makes us better. And the last thing I'll say, I don't know if Abstract has it, but in NYU, I teach this course on talent development. And I have 4 books that we read over the course of the semester. And one of the books is called Difficult Conversations. And, sometimes people just don't have the tools to be able to have difficult conversations. And so I would encourage you all to explore making sure that your managers have the tools to be able to, when they are called out, that they know how to handle it, right? That is not met with, oh, we're firing this person, or, they're being, um, X, Y, and Z. So I think we really have to dismantle this culture and normalize being able to say how you feel without any backlash. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. And that's a perfect segue to move into this concept. Okay, how do we build allyship? How do we become good allies, both as colleagues, but also for managers? And that leads to another great question from our audience, and that's as a manager of a diverse team, what is a very deliberate and tangible thing I can do to ensure they have the support they need and feel included, like those proactive steps, maybe before it comes to a confrontation?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So again, I want to remind all of our managers to ask everyone on your team. If you have a diverse team, ask everyone, what do you need from me to be successful? What do you need from me? What are your short-term and long-term goals while you're here, so that I can help you get there? When I wrote the memo, Kirsten, I interviewed hundreds of women of color, and 70% of them said they felt that their managers were not invested in their success. And that's a
Mhm.
huge
Yeah.
number. And I do believe that's a direct correlation between the advancement of women of color in the workplace, that you don't see a lot of women of color in leadership positions, because ideally it would be your managers that's helping advance your career, right? So if you're not getting that investment from your manager, then who are you supposed to get it from? So this is really important that managers look and say, how am I invested in every person on the team? Right? And that's how you create the equity, right? So another way is making sure that there are meeting norms. So if there are certain people on your team that tend to say things that are not politically correct, that are not psychologically safe, that we don't continue to normalize letting whoever be whoever, letting other people bring their authentic self to work, but them bringing their authentic self to work is causing harm. It's not creating a psychologically safe environment. So we need to normalize that behavior is not okay. So going back to the example that I just gave, a woman recently had emailed me, and she said she was in a Zoom meeting, and because many of us are can't go and get our hair done like we once did in the same ways, she had her hair in a natural hairstyle, and when she was able to go and get her hair blown out, straightened, when she came back to the Zoom call that Monday, the CEO of the company said, "Oh, so and so, I see that you finally got your hair done," in front of the whole leadership team. You know how that made her feel? Nobody said anything. Nobody has still said anything. That was months ago, right? So
Oh
now
my word.
she feels every time she gets on the Zoom call, she's hoping, okay, does my hair look right? What's going to happen? She has that trauma from that micro or macro aggression, however you want to solve it. Now, if you're a manager and that happens, you can't let that go, right? Maybe you don't say anything on the call, like, hey, you don't say that to Minda, maybe that's not the route you want to take, but you
Yeah.
might after the call say, Jim, I know, or Kim, or whomever, what you said to Minda on that call, I wanted to let you know that was inappropriate. How do you think that might have made Minda feel? Right? I know you might not have meant that. I know your intention was probably good, but it still caused harm. So I just want you to be aware of that. When we talk about allyship takes courage. the definition of courage is the ability to do something that frightens one, right? So if it's one
Mhm.
thing, everybody can call themselves an ally, but ask yourself this tough question. When's the last time you've demonstrated allyship? And if you haven't demonstrated it in a real way, then you have to really consider, am I an ally, right? Because being an ally requires something from you, and that's being aware of when certain things go. Maybe it doesn't cause you harm, but you know that it caused someone harm. So it's up to you to activate that. And if any of you, when you were younger, might have been in like a Girl Scouts, Brownies, Boy Scouts, Cubs, or 4-H, in order to get a badge, you had to do the thing. You had to do an act, right? And so, in order to be a good ally, it's not enough just to call yourself that. Now it's time to shift it into action, because being an ally is when it counts. Out of all the situations I wrote about in the memo, I often think, what if I would have had one colleague who activated their allyship? Because I'm sure all of my
Mm.
colleagues saw themselves as allies, but not all of them were willing to say something when it needed to be said. And it shouldn't be on the woman of color or those in the minority in the company to have to solve all the problems. We didn't create these
Yeah.
problems, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's up to those who are causing these problems to help solve the problems. And so think about it. When was the last time you've demonstrated allyship, and in a real way? And then the other thing that I'll say is, allyship is not a one size fits all. The way you ally for me, it requires you to get to know me, to know how I would like you to show up for me, right? So if
Yeah.
you have,
Yeah.
5 Black women that you work with, one of us may not want you to show up in that way that the other does, but it requires relationship building. And when you build relationships with people, you won't let anyone say anything that's not true. You won't say anything that's not harmful in the workplace, right? And so dignity and respect should be table stakes, and we should create that for everybody in our workplaces.
Absolutely. The key word there being relationships. And every person is different. All of us are different. All of us respond in different ways, have different things, emotions and work styles and personality styles and differences. And you're right, relationships seem to be one of the key drivers of progress. And that actually leads to another relationship that I'd like to talk with you about, and that is mentorship. You've mentioned it a few times, and it's so key. And you talk about it, you mentioned mentorship in conjunction with sponsorship, which I love that word too. And someone actually asked, what avenue did you use to find mentors or sponsors to help you continue to grow in the workplace? And what suggestions would you give people who are seeking a mentor or a sponsor?
Yes, absolutely. Shout out to all the mentors and the sponsors out
Yeah.
there in the world, because it really does make a difference in someone else's career. I often say that success is not a solo sport. We can't get to where we want to
Mhm.
get to. We can't get to that table alone. We need people who are invested. We need a squad of people who are invested in our success. And when I was in my former life, when one bit of advice that I got, and maybe some of you received this information when you got into the workforce, was work hard and keep your head down. And while I was working hard and keeping my head down, I realized that there was so many other things were happening that I was not a part of the conversations, because I wasn't building that social capital. People who needed to know me didn't know me, right? Because yes, I was doing my job, but I wasn't building those relationships as well. And it's the yes and so one of the things I noticed that some of my colleagues were doing really well was building that social capital. They had people who were speaking their names and thinking about them for things. And when I realized that, oh, okay, I need to be doing this too, I thought about, who do I need inside the workplace that can be on my team? I believe that each of us is like the captain of their team, right? The captain of their squad, and you need others who are helping you get your seat at the table, if you will. And so in my former life, I realized, oh, okay, I need to build relationships with someone in the human resource department, right? It's good to know they know what's coming down the
Always.
pipeline. They know what's going on, right? I needed a ally in the HR office. So that was one mentorship type of relationship that I had. I had someone in IT, right? It's always nice to have somebody in
Mhm.
IT that you can
Yeah.
rely on, right? But building these authentic relationships. But the one thing that I would say in regards to building that team, so you figure out who you need on your team and start to build those relationships. But then the other thing is, one of the second most senior person in the firm that I worked at before, they worked on my floor. And I realized, wow, I really need him to know that I exist, right? I need him to know what I'm
Mhm.
doing. And I realized, okay, relationship building, right? I didn't want to just, be talking to him just to be talking to him, but I wanted to strategically start to get to know him and him know my work, because he's someone who needs to know I exist, right? And if I didn't make the effort to get to know him, Kirsten, I might still be sitting in my cube waiting on him to come talk to me, right? But I realized that
Yeah,
I had to
good
get out
point.
there. So, a very long story short, as I started to build this relationship with Chuck, he got to know about my work, right? So when I'd see him in the hallway or I'd see him in the elevator and he'd say, "Hey, Minda, how's it going?" I wouldn't just say, "Great, Chuck," and not and keep about my business or keep staring at the elevator doors, right? I would say, "Oh, actually, I'm working on this really great project, blah, blah, blah." I would drop these seeds of things I was doing. And so maybe 6 months after I started building a relationship with him, he was in one of his senior meetings. I was not a part of that meeting, but he had these senior meetings. And I think this is very pivotal so people can see themselves in this too. He was in a conversation, and the CEO had gotten sick and they couldn't take this big client meeting to close a deal that was happening in San Francisco. And so she was asking everybody around her leadership team who could go to San Francisco and take this meeting. All of her, senior staff had already meetings they were going and travels that were already booked. So she's like, "Oh, I think we should just cancel this to another time." And Chuck said, "You know what? Actually, Minda's in San Francisco right now. Why don't we let her take that meeting?" And everybody in that room, because they did
Cool.
not know me, was like, "No, she's too junior. We don't know her. No, no, no." And he's like, "No, actually, I believe that she can do it. She just needs the opportunity. I'll put my neck out there." Kirsten, I got the call out of the blue. I'm just doing my work, right, up in San Francisco, and I get the call, and he's like, "Don't drop this ball. Throwing you a ball." And just like Hamilton, I didn't throw away my shot. I nailed it. I closed the deal, and a few months later, I was promoted, and I had a seat at that table just from him speaking my name. Even when people said, "We don't know her, she's too junior, she's too this," and it didn't take anything away from him. Sometimes people think that they can't speak somebody else's name, or they can't invite them to the front seat of the car, right? Or they can't do something because it's going to take away their seat. No, this is about adding seats to the table. And
Mm,
so now that he brought somebody that wasn't on their radar, now people looked at me different, right? And then I got to bring other people along and speak their names. And so I didn't know he would be a mentor. I didn't know he would be a sponsor. I never asked him to do that. We started to build those relationships. But the other part of that, when that opportunity came my way, I was ready. So so what we can control in the equation is our preparation. So never discount, and you just never know when that opportunity. But again, where do you sit in the car? What influence can you create? And we can all do that. You don't have to be one of the most senior people to be able to create an opportunity for someone.
yeah. That is such a cool story. And I'm so glad that you shared it. And I want to encourage people to, that's why this book, The Memo, is so great, because Minda shares so many real life examples, just like this one, of ways that, her own personal experiences as well as others, and things that you all can take from this and directly apply. And I love that story. Um, and go Chuck for being a good ally.
Everybody get a check, get a check.
Yes, get a check. And get a Minda because she
Yeah.
closes the deal. Um, so just a few more questions here. We're close to wrapping up. One is from the audience as well, asking, how do you inform your managers that they need leadership development? It's a very tactical phrase, without causing tension and fearing retention, or fearing that negative feedback, I think.
Yep, I love this question. And that actually, this is where, so I do a lot of consulting with companies and a lot of leadership development training. And I really do believe that if we're going to make the workplace work for everybody, it has to be modeled. We need to have leaders and managers who are modeling this behavior so that others can know what good looks like. That's what this is all about. And so HR, your training development, that should be a core pillar. Leadership development. The issue that happens is that sometimes people are advanced or promoted to manage people that are not good people managers, and you're given opportunities to manage a team. You've never given a one-on-one. You don't know any conflict resolution skills. You're just trying to make it through the day, and I know that that can be hard. And then what happens is, because that manager, well intentioned, doesn't know how to properly and effectively manage diverse teams, or teams, any team for that matter, it hurts the retention rate. And especially it hurts the retention rate of those women of color, because again, they don't have managers who are comfortable talking about race. They don't have managers that are comfortable creating environments or addressing, some of those elephants in the room. So I do believe that this is where leadership has to create the curriculum, or work with people like myself and other consultants to build out that leadership development. Because if every manager is equipped to be able to lead inclusively, then that creates the equity that we want on every team. But you can't expect that if you haven't given people training. Some people have that innate ability to manage and be equitable, but not everybody has that. So for me, I don't think that the employee should have to tell their manager, you need some leadership development training. I think that that should be something that should be implemented from, HR or talent management, or whomever's in control of those lunch and learns, right? So even if it's a lunch and learn that you make mandatory for all managers. The last thing I'll say is, in my class at NYU, one of the simulations that I do with my students is how to give an effective one-on-one, because I don't want my students to leave and be playing guinea pig on somebody that they don't know how to give an effective one-on-one, right? So we
Yeah.
talk about what you need to say, what you should not say, what's helpful, because we should be getting to solutions when we're having conversations, not creating more friction. And so I think, that's one of the number one things that the students walk away with. They're like, oh my God, that was so helpful. Because even if I'm not a manager, just to be able to have these type of conversations. So again, I think that this is something that, when you think about bringing in trainers or creating curriculum, make sure that your managers are equipped, because that will really make sure that you'll see your retention numbers skyrocket, because so much happens on that managerial level.
Absolutely. One of our last questions, this is a really nice one from one of our viewers, and that is, what is one thing you would tell your younger self just starting out in your career? Reflections, hindsight, what would you share with a young Minda?
Oh, so many things, but the one thing I would say I would share is this quote by Audre Lorde. It says, "Beware of feeling you're not good enough to deserve it." And I wish I would have known that, right? That I deserve an environment in which I can thrive in. I deserve to be seen just like all my other colleagues. I deserve to be respected just like all of my colleagues, that I shouldn't be met with any racial aggression. I should be able to do the job that I was hired to do without feeling othered. And if at any time you do feel that way, maybe this is not the place for you, because that is what you deserve, right? So many of us go through our lives not even knowing what a good workplace feels like, not knowing what belonging and inclusivity feels like, or equity. And so again, that should be table stakes. So I would remind myself that I didn't have to take on all of that racial trauma that was given to me over a lot of my career, that I deserved better than that. And so I hope that all of you will think about, again, how do we make the workplace work for everybody? That starts with you. What are you going to do to make sure that you create an environment that works for everybody?
Those are some wonderful words to end on. Minda, thank you so much for your great book, for the work that you're doing, for your voice, and the inspiration you are to so many other people, and women of color, but not just women of color, to all of us. Truly, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank all of you so much for joining us. This is a real honor to be able to host this conversation today. I want to let all of you know that, again, you will be getting a recording of this webinar if you'd like to watch it again or share it internally. And if you want to reach out to us at any time you have any questions, corporate@getAbstract.com. We'd love to hear from you. And also check out the memo. read the abstract on getAbstract.com, buy the book, read the whole thing, full of those amazing anecdotes like Minda shared. And also, if this is, I mean, this is obviously an incredibly important, relevant topic. There's a lot more to read and educate yourself, as we talked about today. And you can find a lot of other books on diversity and racial justice and inclusion and how to do that as a leader, as a manager on the getAbstract library as well. So read the memo, continue reading and educating yourself about this so we can truly make the workplace work for everyone. Minda, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much. Stay tuned to getAbstract to find out about our next webinars. Wishing you a wonderful day wherever you are, and we'll see you very soon. Bye.